We don't have proper data on what's happened in Holland, but we do know in Holland as a whole. But we do know in Amsterdam that 50% of all people who present with psychosis present because they're using high potency cannabis. Now that would be 30% in the UK. It would be about 25% in Paris, and in southern Italy, it would be down about 5 to 10%.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So Professor Sir Robin Murray, thank you so much for joining me on The No Show. I'm really pleased to have you. Let's start with your own personal journey. What sort of led you down this route of wanting to sort of the deep dive into psychiatry?
Well, I went to a boarding school when I was a child, and then I hated it. And when I got to be about 15, I got interested in the mind and in psychology, probably because I wasn't very happy at the time. And I discovered the work of Freud, who you can perhaps see on the wall behind me there. And Freud was very, he thought that sexual frustration was a very important thing. And he was also very interested in philosophy. So for a 15-year-old at boarding school, sexual frustration and an interest in philosophy was very convincing. So that got me interested in psychiatry.
That's a really interesting start. And I presume you sort of followed the traditional path into becoming a psychiatrist.
Yes, sure. You have to study medicine first. And although anatomy and biochemistry were a bit of a bore, one has to plow through it until eventually you get to the clinic, and then you can obviously you learn about surgery and medicine, and then neurology and psychiatry.
So did you always know that you were going to get into psychiatry after sort of just going through medical school?
Oh yes, sure.
Okay. So that's a sort of a interesting starting point, because see, now you've got into the world of psychiatry, and you're doing all this fascinating research. There's quite a few strands to your research that aren't identical, but they're similar. So you've looked at, for example, the use of cannabis and how cannabis impacts psychosis, and you've done a really interesting bit of research on that. Before we dive into it, what can you sort of explain to our audience what is psychosis?
So psychosis is really just a posh name for hearing voices, or having very strange delusions, often paranoid delusions, thinking that other people are against you, or thinking that the man down the street is trying to influence your brain, or that your parents are trying to poison you. It's really a collection of symptoms. It's not really a disease. We call that psychosis. And if it just happens once or twice, we call it psychosis. But if it keeps happening and becomes more severe, we call it schizophrenia.
Okay, and these sort of collection of symptoms, are they sort of identical in terms of what their nature, or do they vary widely from patient to patient?
No, they vary quite a lot, but the core symptoms of hearing voices and paranoia they occur across different cultures. And so if you go and talk to somebody who is psychotic in Ethiopia, or you talk to somebody who's psychotic in Hong Kong or in Los Angeles or in the UK, very much the same kind of experiences.
And I mean, the changes that the changes that happen in the brain in psychosis, are they are these changes biological, or these changes just vary from patient to patient? Is it like a structural change in the brain that causes this, or is it just experiences?
Well, I think there is a temptation when one's talking about the brain to think, is it all psychological or is it all biological? But of course, it's a bit of both. And so we know that when people are actually hallucinating and actively deluded, that they're synthesizing too much of a neurotransmitter called dopamine in a particular part of the brain called the striatum. So that underlies the symptoms, but we know that that can be caused by social factors. So we know that children who are abused have an increased risk of psychosis, or we know that people who are beaten up in the street or suffer some very adverse, intrusive life event, that can increase dopamine, and that can increase the chances of psychosis. So I like to say psychosis is a brain disease like asthma is a lung disease. We all know that asthma is a inflammation of the lining of the tubes in the lungs. We also know that if you live near a motorway, then that makes the inflammation worse. And similarly, psychosis is a dysfunction of the brain, but the function of the brain is to deal with the social environment. And when there's toxic things in the social environment, this can cause the dopaminergic abnormality and the resultant psychosis.
So you mentioned that different factors contribute to the prevalence of psychosis amongst people. One of the things that you've looked at is cannabis, and obviously now you've made clear before the recording that it's widely agreed upon that cannabis results in psychosis, or an extreme use of cannabis results in psychosis.
Yeah. So when we started looking at this question, well, when I started in psychiatry many years ago, we never talked about cannabis at all. And it was only in the 1990s that patients' relatives would start saying to us, do you think my son's illness or my brother's illness could have anything to do with the cannabis that he smokes all day? And we would say, no, cannabis is a safe drug. But gradually we heard more of this, and then we started investigating, and lo and behold, that people who smoke cannabis have a higher risk of developing psychosis. So it's not the only cause. Psychosis is multifactorial. There's several different factors. You inherit a vulnerability. You may have a problematic childhood. You may abuse drugs. You may encounter a lot of adversity. So all of these factors add up and push you over the threshold into psychosis.
And typically the sort of the treatment for psychosis is drugs.
Well, it's medication and usually cognitive behavior therapy as well. So there's no sense just slugging people with antipsychotics. You can't really change people's mind. Say somebody believes that the man down the street is ganging up, getting all the other neighbors together to try and harm him. You can give a medication which will calm the patient down and will make him less preoccupied with this, but you can't change his mind. Just like, giving antipsychotics to Trump wouldn't have made him more sensible because he had daft ideas. So you have to use psychological means to change people's daft ideas. Though I'm not necessarily saying it would have worked for Trump.
And so this is really interesting because is it just cognitive behavioral therapy that is the non-invasive or non-drug treatment to it, or are there other sort of methods of dealing with trying to treat psychosis?
Well, obviously, if say somebody is in an intolerable work situation, or they're in poverty, or they're in some terrible social situation, you can't really expect them to get better until you try and resolve their situation. So the old joke is that that the professionals want to give the patient insight, but what the patient wants is somebody to pay the rent. So it's you have to resolve the social pressures, and you have to then see if somebody thinks that their neighbors are ganging up against them. You have to say, "Are you sure of that? What is the evidence? Is it possible you might be mistaken?" And discuss these other possibilities.
I mean, these sorts of questions, I would sort of assume that somebody who has psychosis and is being asked this sort of stuff by their relatives and their loved ones, etc., might sort of come across as really sort of uh, condescending in a way to them in that current situation. Can that be sort of more harmful than it is good?
No, I don't. I don't think it's more harmful, but certainly arguing with patients. I think that it's usually the case that relatives say, "What in God's name why on earth do you say that?" That the people down the road, they're very nice. These people are. You think that the CIA are putting a chip in your brain to monitor you. Why would the CIA bother with you? And they get sort of angry and say, "That's just ridiculous. Change your mind and get on with life." Now, arguing with people like that in that sort of way just makes people more sure of it's like if you argue with politics and you shout at even your best friend about his daft political views, then he'll get just more entrenched. But if you have a nice quiet discussion with him about the fact that maybe on the one hand and on the other hand, you might get a little bit further. And of course, for somebody who's psychotic, they need somebody who they can trust. So it's important to build up a trusting relationship with them.
I want to go on to another one of the findings that you mentioned before the recording that was really fascinating. But before I do, I just want to remind our audience that they can support the show by finding our link on Patreon. So that's patreon.com/The No Show. And you can become a member and help us keep the show alive so we can bring more fascinating researchers like Professor Robin Murray onto the show. So there's this finding that you mentioned that sort of caught my attention, which was that there are higher rates of psychosis amongst immigrants.
Yes, and this has been known in the UK since the 60s and 70s, that people, particularly who started coming from the Caribbean then, were being diagnosed as having psychosis and schizophrenia more frequently than expected. And for a long time, there was an argument about were British psychiatrists misunderstanding the culture of people from the Caribbean. But then we got Caribbean psychiatrists to come and see the patients, and they agreed, no, they were psychotic. And we then looked to see, are people in the Caribbean or in Africa, do they have high rates of psychosis intrinsically anyway? And the answer is no. So it's not being of African origin, it's being of African origin in Europe, because the same finding happens in other countries in Europe. So it's coming from the Caribbean or Africa and coming into a predominantly white country shoots up one's rates. Now, most migrants there is an effect on migration, like white migrants into Britain, but it's not such a big effect as for black migrants into Britain. So there's been a lot of dispute about this, and it doesn't seem to be a biological thing. It's more about the social position of people in society.
It also raises a sort of a sensitive issue here, because it's an issue that can sort of flare up all the sort of wrong ideologies, which is immigrants are more predisposed to smoking cannabis or using drugs than non-immigrants. But what you're saying is that it's not so much that cannabis is the thing that's causing this. It's the social issues that they're facing that are causing sort of a higher rate amongst immigrants.
Well, you say there are higher rates of drug use amongst immigrants. I don't think that's actually true. We've looked at that, and we found no difference in the, for example, smoking cannabis between black and white people. In fact, one of the groups who were least likely to smoke cannabis were migrants from Africa.
Hmm.
So so there is an effect of cannabis, but I think that there is an additional effect of being a migrant. And I guess one of the question is if you frequently find yourself discriminated against, if you're born to in the inner city, and your teacher seems to be somehow against you, if the other boys or girls in the school seem to not want to play with you, you leave school, you kind of get a job, the police lift you, and do you after a while begin to blame society? Well, you've got perhaps got a right to blame society for discriminating against you, but does this transfer into when you're not being discriminated against? Are you so used to it happening that you might become paranoid about people being against you? So that is one hypothesis as to why the rates are higher.
And I reckon that the hypothesis also in my mind that hypothesis dispels a lot of the narrative that is sort of distributed in certain radical groups in society who want to create these perceptions of people. But you raise a really interesting point in that the social issues far outweigh anything else. I'm interested to know though, in places like the Amsterdam, where it's a predominantly white European population, and who are known for sort of their openness about cannabis, is there a higher rate of psychosis?
Well, there is a higher rate. We don't have proper data on what's happened in Holland, but we do know in Holland as a whole. But we do know in Amsterdam that 50% of all people who present with psychosis present because they're using high potency cannabis. Now that would be 30% in the UK. It would be about 25% in Paris, and in southern Italy it would be down about 5 to 10%. So although Holland is often said to have, I mean, I think in many ways they don't send some people to prison for stupidly for using cannabis, but they also have much higher rates of dependence on cannabis, people being admitted to hospital with cannabis-related problems and psychosis.
Do they? I mean, you mentioned earlier on that psychosis is sort of a one or once or twice where you have these episodes, but on a long term is schizophrenia. So, are there sort of any links between schizophrenia and countries that have are open with their use of cannabis?
Well, what we have found is that if you look across Europe, then the rates of psychosis are much higher in the big cities in the north, in Amsterdam, London, and Paris, and the rates are much lower in southern Italy and in Spain. And we attribute this to the greater use of high potency cannabis. So look, people in Spain and in Italy use cannabis, of course, but their cannabis is not as potent as it is
Mhm.
in the Netherlands. And of course, if you go to North America, if you go to Colorado, you can get much more high potency cannabis. So when we talk about high potency cannabis and skunk. It's got about 15% of THC, the active ingredient. You can find cannabis in Colorado that's 50% or 70% or 90% or 99% cannabis. So it's a bigger difference than between lager and vodka. That vodka or whiskey is only about 50% alcohol, but you can now get over 90% pure THC in cannabis.
So these these high potencies that are available in like you said, Colorado, aren't they just out and out just dangerous to take altogether?
I think it depends how often you take them, and also, I guess you're good or bad luck with your genes, because most people who use it's like alcohol. Most people who use alcohol don't run into trouble. Most people who use cannabis don't run into trouble. But the more you use the high concentration alcohol, the more you use high potency cannabis, then the greater your risk. So for cannabis, it's still a minority. So in our studies, even people who use cannabis every day, 90% will be okay, but the remainder won't. So it's one of these questions that what is the balance in society between the majority of people enjoying cannabis and the minority at risk? Like with alcohol, majority of people using alcohol sensibly, but a minority becoming addicted and getting liver failure and all sorts of physical problems.
As a seasoned psychiatrist and somebody who's been involved in the industry for quite a long time, from your sort of just your own opinion, do you think legalizing cannabis is a smart move, or do you think there's still not enough evidence?
I think it's very unclear. So far, most of the places that have legalized cannabis have ended up with higher potency and more problems. But of course, less people in jail and less waste of police time. So it's quite difficult. I think there ought to be some way of at least decriminalizing or even possibly legalizing without having a greater use and more potent cannabis, but nobody has managed it yet. So there's a lot of different things happening in America. Maybe somebody will find a way of legalizing without more problems. I think personally, education is the most important. Tobacco is legal, but everybody knows that it's dumb to smoke cigarettes because we're going to end up with lung cancer. But personally, I think we should be doing similar education for cannabis.
I know you're a bit pressed for time, but I want to just sort of dive into a bit more on the personal side. So you deal with patients who suffer psychosis. I imagine quite well. For yourself, like for you yourself, how do you sort of manage your own well-being and your own health, having to deal with like seeing patients going through so much on a day-to-day basis? What do you sort of do to make sure you stay in check and you're feeling all right?
Well, I think when you start as a psychiatrist and when you encounter the terrible things that happen to people and the difficulties they get into, you can be emotionally washed away and become over involved. And I look back on it, and I can think of lots of times where I was so distressed about a patient's difficulties. As you get older, you begin to and you see more. You begin to become less personally distressed by it. I think the important thing is not to become blasé, and you still have to be interested and care for your patients and be involved with them, because what do psychiatrists and psychologists have to offer their patients? Well, they have their support and their affection and their caring, as well as any particular techniques or medication. So it's important that we don't just think, well, it's just another person who's gone psychotic. It's an individual who is struggling with some terrible developments in life. And one of the things about people with psychosis is they often have had terrible things that happen in their life. That when I think of the difficulties that some of my patients have encountered in 5 years, they've encountered more adversity than I have in my life.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine. I can imagine. And it must be sort of. I mean, over time, you've been able to sort of take a step back and be able to see the bigger picture. What advice would you give to somebody who's sort of at that beginning stage, or somebody who wants to get into to the field of psychiatry? What kind of pointers would you give them?
Oh, it's a most wonderful job. That the mind is such a fascinating thing. I mean, I always say to medical students and people interested in medicine, well, the pancreas is quite interesting, or the thyroid is quite interesting, or even the heart is quite interesting, or the kidneys are quite interesting. But if you have a problem with your kidneys, you can get another one. You can get a transplant. You cannot transplant the mind because it's unique. And it's the last frontier of medicine and trying to understand. And I think we're going to learn so much more, and we're going to be able to help people a great deal more through medicine and the mind.
Where can people find you online or interact with you?
I'm not especially I don't blog or I don't Twitter, I'm afraid. But you can see various things lectures or talks I've given on YouTube.
Mm-hmm. And obviously you have the university profile page, so we'll link that onto the episode so people can explore your research a bit more. Robin, I really appreciate your time. I think your work's fascinating, and it's a shame we couldn't have a bit longer, but I think your work's amazing, and I hope listeners do check it out, because this is the start of a conversation that definitely needs to be had, particularly with regards to migrants and that sort of stuff. So thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.